All right, let's take chapter 23 by the horns and complete this chapter on microbial diseases of the cardiovascular and lymphatic systems from our microbiology textbook by Tortora. Ehrlichiosis and anaplasmosis are diseases caused by two very, very similar microorganisms. They're both obligate intracellular parasites. Um, Ehrlichia chafiensis is a gram-negative rickettsia-like microbe, and it lives inside of monocytes, and the bacteria aggregate in the monocytes, forming what are called morula. The vector is the lone star tick, and the reservoir is the white-tailed deer. So Ehrlichias get into the blood and inhabit those monocytes and can live in the monocytes and cause disease. Anaplasma phagocytophilum is another gram-negative obligate intercellular parasite. In this case, the vector is Ixodes ticks, and it also forms morula, but this time in neutrophils. Now, these are pretty serious diseases, mortality a little bit less than 5%. So it makes it, well, the way they wrote that, fatality less than 5%. Sounds like they're like thinking that's fine. They're just saying is it's not quite 5%. It's probably like something like 4.8%. And it probably varies annually anyway. So around 5%. That's pretty terrible. 1 in 20 people infected with these diseases dies. It's pretty rough going. Typhus, caused by Rickettsia species, just like we were just talking about, also obligate intracellular parasites. They infect the endothelial cells, the lining cells of the blood vessels that make up the wall of the capillaries, and they block and rupture the small vessels, and that causes a rash of tiny bleeds under the skin or in the skin. They're spread by arthropod vectors. So, okay, firstly, typhus fever. Epidemic typhus, it was typically known as epidemic louse-borne typhus, they're calling it, and now they're calling it typhus fever. Typhus fever. It's caused by Rickettsia proezekii, and it's carried by body lice. That's the vector. Pediculus humanus. When you have large populations of people, like armies that are in a war situation, away from home, crowded in a situation where they don't have good hygiene, or in camps of refugees, similar situation. They're all crowded in there. They don't have access to good showers and hygiene and stuff, and then outbreaks of lice, and then outbreaks of typhus fever, a very terrible disease. The louse bites, and the feces are then rubbed into the bite wound, and that's what inoculates the human. It causes prolonged fever and rash of red spots because of the hemorrhaging. Treated with tetracycline and chloramphenicol. You may remember that when we talked about antibiotics, those are two that can penetrate down into cells and go in after those things. Then we come to endemic murine typhus. That's a little bit more mild version, caused by Rickettsia typhi. It's transmitted by rat fleas. So rodents are the common hosts, and mortality, again, same range. Clinically indistinguishable from typhus fever, treated with tetracycline and chloramphenicol. Different bacteria, similar disease. Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Rickettsia rickettsii. And this one is spread by wood ticks and dog ticks, those big gray ones I was telling you about in some parts of the country. They form a measles-like rash, except the rash also appears on the palms and soles, whereas in measles that doesn't happen. The palms and soles stay clear. Mortality rate is very high without early diagnosis. Real serious one, this one. Remember, there's some old folk songs from the days of the American wagon trains traveling out west, and people getting Rocky Mountain spotted fever. The funny thing is, Rocky Mountain spotted fever is endemic in more eastern areas of the country, as you can see here. So the question is, why Rocky Mountain spotted fever? Anyway, people traveling from the East Coast out into the territories apparently got sick from Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Maybe it's because they were heading to the Rocky Mountains. Tick-borne typhus. There's just a little diagram of the Rocky Mountain spotted fever life cycle of rabbits, reservoir, ticks bite the human, transmit to human. The tick matures, lays eggs. Eggs hatch and form the larvae, which go on to rabbits and so forth. So, this poor gentleman, looks like he's off to school. Well, hopefully he's got plenty of tetracycline handy. There's a picture of Rocky Mountain spotted fever on the skin, the rash. Burkitt's lymphoma. It's a B-cell cancer. Forms typically in the jaw, the mandible, in the childhood-aged children in Africa. And it's due to Epstein-Barr virus, human herpes virus 4. Most people have gotten Epstein-Barr virus infections and have childhood infections which are asymptomatic, but we'll come back to that in just in a bit. But the Epstein-Barr virus somehow induces mutations in the B cells in which a gene that's supposed to control the cell cycle in the cells at appropriate times gets moved over into a controller for antibody production. So basically massively on, and it makes the cells divide and turn into transformed cells. And normally when cells go hog wild and start dividing excessively, built-in monitoring mechanisms realize that this isn't right, and the cell would kill itself by apoptosis, but somehow the Epstein-Barr virus protects the cells and they survive. So you have these mutated B cells. And again, normally the immune system will take care of things like that, but you bring together this situation where you have some transformed cells that need to be obliterated by the immune system, and malaria suppresses the immune response, and those transformed B cells are more likely to persist, and eventually someone's going to get a tumor that just grows out of control. So that's the connection. It's a little more complex, but the connection between has just recently been discovered to really understand the mechanisms by which there's a almost synergy between malaria and Epstein-Barr virus in the incidence of this Burkitt's lymphoma cancer. So people also with other types of immunosuppression are subject to getting Burkitt's lymphoma. AIDS patients, for example. There's a picture of the growing mass of cancer cells in a cervical lymph node, most likely a group of lymph nodes, someone with Burkitt's lymphoma. Infectious mononucleosis, that's a disease that occasionally plagues people that get an Epstein-Barr virus infection in childhood. Again, most childhood infections with HHV4 are asymptomatic, but some people get a more severe disease in which they have a high fever, sore throat, swollen lymph nodes, and a large spleen. And the virus replicates in resting memory B cells, as we were just talking about, and it forms large B cells with an unusual shaped nucleus. Also, those B cells then are produce heterophile antibodies, large amounts of antibodies that are weak in their affinity and multi-specific. They're not really very specific for anything. There's a test for the heterophile antibodies that's diagnostic for this condition. And also you can look at morphology of cells in the microscope and see these characteristic and large B cells, hence mononucleosis, or mononuclear peripheral blood cells, they're called. And so these enlarged mononuclear cells are symptomatic of Epstein-Barr virus infection. Epstein-Barr virus infection is somehow implicated in an unknown mechanism in autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis. It's also implicated in Hodgkin's lymphoma, another type of B-cell tumor, nasopharyngeal cancer. So the Epstein-Barr virus does some shenanigans with cells and cell cycle and transformation of cells. Also, it's associated in some way with chronic fatigue syndrome that we talked about last time. There's a connection between, or or a epidemiological connection between people that had a strong um, mononucleosis disease and later in life develop um, the chronic fatigue syndrome. Cytomegalovirus, human herpesvirus 5, another one that infects the majority of the population. It's again asymptomatic in most people. Um, it causes infected cells to swell and form so-called owl eyes inclusion. Let's take a look in the microscope and look at the characteristic look of the white blood cells. Unfortunately, CMV, even though it doesn't cause severe disease in the host, it can be transmitted across the placenta and cause a very severe developmental disease, developmental problems in the fetus, in the nervous system. Transmitted sexually through blood or through blood, saliva, transplanted tissue. So, but it's probably even transmitted in other ways than that, because if you look at this chart, my supposition is it's transmitted by more mechanisms than that. If you look at this, here's age in years on the x-axis and percent of the population that's infected with, or that shows antibodies, has been infected with Epstein-Barr virus, 100% by the time you reach the age 50. Probably like almost 90% by the time you reach the age 50 for cytomegalovirus, and around a little bit less than half of the people for Toxoplasma gondii. So pretty amazing high frequency in the population for these viral diseases. Chikungunya, most unfortunate story. Chikungunya is a virus transmitted by Aedes mosquitoes, and it causes a high fever, severe joint pain, rash, and blisters. This is no joke. Has a relatively low death rate, but very, very unpleasant disease indeed. Introduced into the Western Hemisphere only as recently as 2013. More than 1.7 million cases in the Caribbean, and seems like it's relatively soon going to be established in the United States. The first indigenous case in the Western Hemisphere in 2013. Again, Aedes are the Asian tiger mosquito. They have like white, black stripes on their body, and they feed all day. Unlike the mosquitoes that carry malaria, feed only at nighttime, so you mainly need mosquito nets on the beds, and also, of course, eliminating mosquitoes from the community, but much easier to treat in terms of controlling mosquitoes. In this case, the mosquitoes are around all day long. So the changing climate, global warming, is starting to move the vector mosquitoes more and farther north. The climate for them is becoming favorable farther and farther north, and with the vector will ultimately come the disease, and we'll have chikungunya will become endemic in the United States. It's already it's already being locally locally transmitted in Texas and Florida, and so soon it'll probably be a fact of life all through the southern United States as the mosquitoes continue to move up. So the problems, again, the bed nets aren't effective, so there's not that easy, quick solution. Insecticides don't work very well. Hard to keep these guys at bay, these mosquitoes. Aedes albopictus mosquitoes. Some methods of control, making sure there's no standing water on the premises or in the general area. Just trying to find ways to capture the mosquitoes as they breed in the water. Mosquito dunks are a fascinating idea. You can buy these donut-shaped dispensers that release a modified Bacillus thuringiensis bacteria into the water, which when they're eaten by the mosquito larvae, it paralyzes their gut, and they can't feed and they starve. And it's harmless to humans. You can put them right in a swimming pool if you want. You can put them in a kiddie pool. Put them in any water, and it will keep the mosquitoes from breeding in that water. Here's a little diagram of places where there might be some water, just a dripping faucet, so there's always some standing water. That's all it takes. Those mosquitoes will breed there. Old tires are a classic spot. There's a curvature of the rubber, and there's some rainwater will sit in those things, and a lot of mosquitoes can come out of a tire. Kiddie pools that aren't used very often left sitting in the yard, untended pools and hot tubs. Anyway, got to keep those mosquitoes under control. It's going to become more and more of a problem. Yellow fever virus. It's carried by Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, and it causes fever, chills, headache, nausea, and vomiting. So another nasty disease, very, very unfortunate disease. Causes jaundice, it causes liver damage, and that, again, we mentioned before, when the liver's not working, is not picking up the bilirubin, the pigment left over from recycling hemoglobin from worn out red blood cells by macrophages. That bilirubin doesn't get picked up by the liver, so it stays in the blood and has a yellow-green color, and hence that's what jaundice is the appearance of that yellow-green color in the whites of the eyes and the skin, the fingernails, and so forth. There's no treatment for it. There's an attenuated vaccine available. Now, yellow fever was a big problem in the United States at one time, and Walter Reed is a very famous heroic fellow who was an army doctor who did the research necessary to kind of understand the transmission of yellow fever virus and led to the eradication of yellow fever. They didn't know it was carried by mosquitoes. They just didn't know what was causing it. And every summer there'd be these huge outbreaks. Even the city of Pittsburgh once had an enormous outbreak, and that caused a lot of mayhem and unrest. And so they hired Walter Reed to go after this problem, and he solved it. Pretty cool stuff right there. So now there's not much going on in this country. Basically eliminated those mosquitoes by mosquito control. Dengue virus, dengue fever, dengue and severe dengue. It's mild, it's like yellow fever, but milder, but still that doesn't mean it's good. I've heard plenty of people that have gotten it, few people I should say, have gotten it by traveling to Southeast Asia and come back and been very, very disappointed that they got that very memorable disease. So, also carried by these same mosquitoes. Endemic to the Caribbean and tropical environments. Asymptomatic and mild dengue is the more common form. There's also a so-called severe dengue form that can cause severe bleeding and organ impairment. It's thought that maybe one of the mechanisms by which the disease can transform from the mild to the more rare severe dengue form is antibody enhancement, is called. And so if there's already antibodies to the virus when it comes to the body and starts infecting this particular virus, the antibodies bind to the virus, and then the Fc receptor causes them to be phagocytosed by macrophages, and monocytes, they survive and multiply right in those cells. So it almost enhances the uptake of them by phagocytes, which is their home, and they replicate in there, and they cause disease. So kind of ironic. No animal reservoir, no vaccine or effective drug treatment. Just got to treat the symptoms and wait it out. All right, emerging viral hemorrhagic fevers. Marburg virus is almost exactly the same as Ebola virus, and I'm a little surprised they make them out to be such separate diseases. But anyway, Marburg virus was transmitted from, it's thought to be originated in African monkeys. Causes a headache, high fever, but then bleeding on every mucous membrane, every orifice, vomiting, blood, profuse bleeding internally and externally, and a very high fatality rate. Very terrible disease indeed. Marburg, Germany, there was an outbreak, and that's when it was first realized what it was, and that's where the name comes from, I think in the 1980s. Lassa fever, this is an arenavirus, and it's transmitted in rodent urine. It comes from West Africa. Similar to some other viral fevers that occur in other parts of the world, so it's quite a nasty one. Quite a nasty one. Ebola virus is again another hemorrhagic virus, another filovirus, and it This is thought to have arisen in cave-dwelling fruit bats near the Ebola River in Africa, and it spreads by contact with infected body fluids, very easy to transmit, um, damages blood vessel walls in a similar way, and interferes with coagulation, much like Marburg virus, and causes bleeding all over the place. Mortality rate around 90%. Um, there is now a recombinant vaccine. There's been a couple of big outbreaks um, in the last probably 15 years in Africa, and so they've really been working hard to get a way to get this under control. It's very difficult to manage. Healthcare workers get infected and die, all kinds of problems. Originally, when it was first discovered, it was thought that it would never really produce much of an epidemic because it's so lethal, it would kill off its host so fast there wouldn't be any way for it to spread. Unfortunately not. Terrible epidemics in Africa. I'd like to get that one under control. There's some filoviruses, filamentous viruses. Hantavirus is another emerging pathogen. It's caused by this Cynombre virus. Causes fatal pulmonary infections. The lungs fill with edema. Edema is the formation of fluid outside the blood vessels, leaking out of the blood vessels. Comes from the southwest in the United States. Causes hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, as well as this edematous lung, a fatal lung condition. This looks like somebody got chikungunya, severe joint pain. That's the hallmark. A little summary table. Chagas disease is called American trypanosomiasis. Trypanosomes are flagellated protozoans and reservoir in rodents, possums, and armadillos, and it's transmitted to humans by the kissing bug or the duviid bug, and they bite on the face oftentimes, and then that causes the person to smack at them or wipe them away, and in so doing they sweep the feces from the bug right into the bite wound, and that inoculates the person with the trypanosome cysts. Chronic form of the disease can cause megaesophagus, the esophagus all swollen, and megacolon, death due to heart damage. So it can be a severe disease. It's a chronic disease. It's very hard to treat it. The trypanosomes multiply intracellularly, so it's hard to get in after them. And remember, it's different than bacteria, where you can exploit the different ribosomes and so forth. These are eukaryotes, and there's a bad trypanosome. Causes that disease. Toxoplasmosis, we've already run across Toxoplasma gondii, and undergoes its sexual phase in cats, the definitive host, and the cats shed oocysts, durable cysts in their feces, and they're picked up by cows, for example, and if you eat the undercooked meat, you'll wind up with the cysts. In ingesting the cysts, they'll form trophozoites that will invade the cells and tissues. The biggest problem with Toxoplasma gondii, as we've mentioned before, is the congenital infection. It can cross the placenta and get into the fetus and cause severe neurological damage or stillbirth. So something like, as we saw in a previous slide, almost half of the human population has been affected by Toxoplasma gondii. So it's not a severe, horrible disease, or something would be made of that situation. But the fact is, pregnant women should stay away from sources of toxoplasma, such as cat litter boxes and so forth. And this just shows the life cycle. Cat eats mouse, the cysts are in the bradiozoites, are in the tissues, and the cat gets it. The sexual phase of reproduction takes place. Oocysts are shed in the feces. They mature and get into the intermediate host, which is mice, or they may be picked up by cows. They're not they're a dead-end host, but they can harbor the cysts, which humans can eat and get disease from that method, or can get exposed to cat feces and get contact with and get the disease. Here's a nice woman cleaning her cat box, and if she's not careful, she's going to expose herself to the oocysts in the cat feces. Malaria, there's a bad one. Plasmodium are apocomplexan protozoa, and they are transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes, which feed at night, and cause something like 500,000 deaths annually. This is a fairly major problem. It's a neglected disease. There are multiple species. The worst one is Plasmodium falciparum, causes the most deadly and severe type form of malaria. Affects the kidneys, liver, and brain by blocking blood capillaries because it affects the red blood cells, causing severe anemia. Malaria was a fairly big problem in the United States, but again, the mosquito type, these Anopheles mosquitoes are fairly controlled in the United States now. The vast majority of cases, there's about 2,000 cases a year in the United States, and almost all of them come from people that travel outside the United States and come back having been infected and have severe disease. It's not transmitted here by mosquitoes. So we just, mosquito is the definitive host, and it transmits sporozoites into the bloodstream of the human when it takes a blood meal. The sporozoites go to the liver, undergo schizogony, that sort of partial cell division where you have a whole bunch of nuclei, and eventually suddenly all of the divisions complete, separated into individual cells called merozoites. And those are released out of the liver cells into the blood, and they infect red blood cells. So the merozoites then multiply by schizogony again in the red blood cells, forming more merozoites, and they eat up the hemoglobin. And periodically, a whole group of red blood cells will burst and let out the merozoites, and then a bunch of toxins that have been accumulating in the red blood cells will come out and cause the severe disease. Extremely unfavorable experience of chills and fever and feeling violently sick. And then all the merozoites go into new red blood cells, and you have a relative period of calm. And then when those guys mature again and burst out, you have this cyclical, that's what's meant by paroxysms of chill and fever from this disease. Again, it very definitely can be fatal by causing kidney and liver damage. One of the diagnostics observations is the ring form of the parasite in the red blood cells in the microscope. Unfortunately, I don't know what happened. I tried to figure out what happened to this these pointers in this diagram can't really do it. I don't know what it was. I think there's something missing that was in the picture, overlaid on the picture where these pointers were for the merozoites, and and they're not there anymore. So it's kind of a mystery. And there we have the life cycle of this plasmodium, and it goes into the red blood cells, divides by schizogony. All the merozoites come out and cyclically go into red blood cells and burst out. Eventually, some gametocytes will form. A few of those will form so that they're taken up from the blood into the mosquito. The sexual phase of the life cycle occurs in the mosquito, and sporozoites are injected into the human body during a blood meal of the mosquito, and the sporozoites go to the hepatocytes in the liver, where they divide by schizogony and produce merozoites, which then go into the blood and so complete the cycle. It's difficult to develop a vaccine because Plasmodium mutates rapidly and also has some ability to switch antigens, evade the immune response. It's difficult to diagnose. Prophylaxis, if you're going to travel to a country where malaria is endemic, you'll be taking a prophylactic medicine before you even leave to get the levels up in your body to make it less likely that you will contract malaria if you do get a mosquito bite. And you'll also be very careful, I suppose, about exposure to mosquitoes. There's a newer drug called artemisinin, which was developed for some other purpose, but found to be fairly effective against malaria because there's a lot of resistance to chloroquine, the main line treatment for malaria heretofore. Prevention is by bed nets because it's a night feeding mosquito variety, and also by controlling mosquitoes in the environment. Leishmaniasis. Leishmania, Donovani, and a couple of other species this disease is transmitted by sandflies, and promastigote is transmitted in saliva from the bites, and the amastigote proliferates in phagocytic cells. So the phagocytes come, gobble it up, and they just live happily in the phagocytes and multiply. There's different forms of leishmania. You can have a cutaneous form where a huge ulcer forms on the skin, and there's a kind of a battle between the parasite and the immune system in the skin. You can have a visceral leishmania, which invades internal organs, a very severe thing, can be fatal. And then you have this mucous membrane infecting one that can cause severe disfigurement because of getting into the mucous membranes. And there's a little picture of a lesion on the skin from cutaneous leishmania, leishmaniasis. I don't think we have a picture of the disfigurement. If you want to look it up, if you're one of the people that has a strong composition, strong constitution, and you want to see, yeah, it's a pretty terrible disease. Sandflies in tropical areas in the Middle East and so forth. Babesiosis is transmitted by Ixodes ticks. And those guys are bad actors, aren't they? Coming up over and again as carrying various parasites and various pathogens. That's a disease that resembles malaria. The parasites replicate in the red blood cells and cause fever and chills and night sweats. Can be treated with azithromycin and atovaquone. This is a disease of Central and South America for the most part. Can cause chronic disease. A 65-year-old man with poor circulation in his legs develops an infection, which eventually worsens and he has to have amputation take place. Looks like gangrene. Clostridium perfringens got into a wound where there wasn't enough oxygen being delivered, and the obligate anaerobes were able to grow in there, and he had to remove those toes to save the rest of the body. And there's some Clostridium perfringens bacteria making some endospores. All right, a couple of helminthic diseases. Schistosomiasis. There's a fluke called a schistosome, and it's transmitted in the water. The swimming for part of the life cycle gets into the human skin. We'll take a look at that in a minute. There's a couple of different forms. The eggs are shed by adult schistosomes that live in the blood vessels around the digestive tract and lodge in the tissues, and cyst in the tissues. So here's a strange thing. It's called a schistosome because it means split. And the male of the species has a slot, and it's like a split in his body, and the female lives right in that groove. And so they have sexual reproduction and produce eggs, which are released into the water, and they hatch into free-swimming Miracidia. The Miracidia infect snails, and the snails release cercaria, and the cercaria can penetrate the skin of humans. And so here's a workaday fisherman, and he's in the water, and it's an area where there's a lot of sewage getting into the water, and a lot of parts of the world don't have the kind of sewage control we do that we appreciate here. And so there's a huge amount of this disease in the world, throughout the world. There's a picture of a granuloma, this sort of connective tissue ball that's formed by around this egg that's got into the tissues. Kawasaki syndrome. It's an acute febrile illness of unknown etiology. There's something, just when you think we know pretty much everything, we don't. Most often affects younger children. An unexplained high fever, widespread rash, hand and feet swelling, and swollen lymph glands. But no microorganism can be isolated. No one knows what causes it. Treated with aspirin to kind of control the fever. Possibly an immunological cause of immune system malfunction. Anyway, very interesting. Got to still solve that one if you're interested in research and you think this is for you, get lit up by that. All right, so that's the end of our chapter on the cardiovascular system. And I promised you last time that we would go next to the respiratory system. I jumped the gun, but next time we will do the respiratory